politics, I say there are two things you have to be able to do. You have to see your own point, and you have to be able to see the other guy's point.
The problem when we go too far back is that it becomes far more emotional and it starts muddying the waters. Now, there's not a single piece of land on this planet that has been inhabited by humans that has not faced migrations, conquest, conquering, annexation, and all that.
Just because someone came here and found the land empty doesn't mean it wasn't owned. So I'm not quite in favor of let's restrict this to the 20th century.
The idea that black people didn't have a sense of ownership before the Europeans came to Africa is completely false. It's just patently false.
Hello, my name is Donald. I'm filling in for Petrus. Petrus is currently in a gay bar hiding in a closet. This is WorldView, where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. In today's group discussion, we will focus on the state of South Africa. With local elections looming, it seems like things are just getting crazier and crazier. Former President Zuma has been released on medical parole. We have an official unemployment rate close to 35%. The ruling party seems to be fracturing, and our government is falling apart. What policies are responsible for this disaster? Is President Ramaphosa incompetent? Is the ANC going to lose the next local election? To help us answer these questions, we are joined by Fadiel Adams, the leader of the Cape Coloured Congress, Dr. Wynand Boshoff, an MP for the Freedom Front Plus, Nicholas Woode-Smith from the Rational Standard, who is also a science fiction and fantasy author, and Hugo Kruger, a structural engineer and the host of a podcast that you can find in the description below. So Fadiel, if you can come back on for us, I want to start with you, or what is your opinion on the state of South Africa? What policy is responsible for this disaster? Who is responsible for this disaster?
The nation is in a state. I can tell you that. The policies that have led us here aren't exactly at fault. I'd say it's the execution. You know, for all its good intentions, for all its brilliant paperwork, the ANC is incapable of governing. It's not taking us anywhere. I think South Africa is in danger of becoming just another failed African state. I think if we don't turn it around within the next 6 to 7 years, there'll be nothing left of us. It is imperative that the ANC loses this election. Whether it will, well, the voters will decide, but we can all hope.
Wynand, do we only have 7 years?
You know, Jan Smuts used to say in South Africa, the best and the worst never happens. And I'm inclined to agree with him. In a certain sense, there have been several instances in our history that one would have thought, okay, this is the end, it can't get worse, and then somehow it gets better for some reason. Of course, not automatically, not just by accident or by, good luck, but because there are always people who decide to turn things around and really to do their best. And I think that is, that is a kind of thing that one has to hold on to say, however bad things happen, it has a way of improving. And the old Free State president that is saying, alles sal regkom as elkeen sy deel doen. Everything will get right if everybody pulls his part or her part. And I think that's what it's all about. Of course, there are many bad policies, as Fadiel has just said. And I think a big a major part of our problem is the strategy that the ANC followed to come to power, because they've followed a strategy which seems as if they thought it would never succeed, because you don't tear down all structures and all order if you think you will be the next government with the obligation to create order and to build things up. So I think that's a big part of the problem. But back to the first sentence, in South Africa, the best and the worst never happens.
Nicholas?
So I'd like to agree that to continue the sentiment, revolutionaries shouldn't lead. And because the problem of revolutionaries is their skill the skill set is effectively around destruction. It's around destroying a present order. And the problem is that the job of a government is to maintain an order, it's to build an order, and it's to maintain stability. Revolutionaries do not know how to govern. So that's one of the biggest problems with the ANC, is that they've destroyed all the crucial institutions that we need to govern. And it all goes back to that, as much as we have distaste for the people that worked in the previous government, the administrators on the ground, we actually needed their skills. And what they should have happened is, instead of firing them and chasing them away, there should have been more absorption and to start continuing so we could adapt good skills into a better policies. Now, I do actually think that there are plenty of bad policies in this country that would be terrible regardless of who's running them. I think that the DA, if the DA was to follow ANC policies and actually implement them properly and competently, I think we would actually be worse off. A lot of time I actually say, thank God that the ANC is so incompetent. Because can you imagine if they were actually able to pass expropriation without compensation and implement it? We would become a borderline a Soviet republic, if not full on. And I think that there's plenty of policies that, regardless of how competent and how technocratic your state is, they will destroy a country. Just look at East Germany compared to West Germany. Same people, same institutional structures to a degree, but same cultural work ethic, but it's stark. Where West Germany embraced free market capitalism and civil liberties and all that, prosperous. East Germany became a dystopian hellhole. Where so many people had become snitches that, in order to maintain social stability after the wall fell, they basically had to just eliminate the records of who were snitches, because it would tear their country apart. So I think the problem in South Africa is who's in charge, it's what they're doing with their policies, it's the base institutions. I don't think, but I do think there is room for hope. There's plenty of skilled and smart, ethical South Africans who are holding the line. And I think we saw that, especially with the riots of all these communities protecting themselves and protecting each other. So I still have hope, but it's not coming from the government.
Hugo, I'll be with you in a moment. I just want to quickly go back to Fadiel. Fadiel, would the DA be worse than the ANC if they were in charge?
I think they would. I'll be honest with you, I think they would. The DA is a much slicker machine than the ANC, but it's a provincial version of the ANC. When it comes to corruption, these people are so good at it, it's hard to catch, but we do catch them here and there. I can tell you this, where I do disagree with the previous speaker is with regards to the land expropriation without compensation. You say it's easy to say it, and I don't mean this as an insult, but I'm going to say it for what it is. When you live in Rondebosch, where you have maybe 300 people living in a square kilometer, but now move to Mitchell's Plain, where you have 3,000 people living in a square kilometer, and you've got acres of land, and the land is owned by, amongst other people, the state, amongst other people, 1% of the population. It is hard for me as a man of color to sit here and actually absorb that part of the conversation, because understand that our land was not bought from us. It was not given away freely. It happened within weeks. I'm assuming that the Fadiel government made the decision to classify me as a colored and therefore to be unfit to own land within days. That I'm assuming that it took them a few hours, maybe less, to draw up the paperwork. I know for a fact that my parents were unceremoniously dumped on the Cape Flats within weeks. So as the land issue, I'm not in total agreement with the ANC, because I do not believe that the state should ever be the sole custodian of the land. Not this state, not this government. But if there's a better idea to take us forward as a people than land expropriation without compensation, somebody needs to give it to me, because I can tell you that the owners of the land never arrive here with title deeds. And somebody needs to explain to me how you get land on a ship, because I fail to understand how vast acres of land.
Fadiel, you muted yourself.
No, sorry, my phone was ringing. I'm struggling to understand how so few can own.
Mute yourself again.
Yeah, man, it's not going to stop and I can't switch it off.
If I may briefly respond.
Sure.
Because I think I may have what you actually want to hear, which is, obviously I can't explain in detail right now, because any good policy requires a lot of work. But I do think there's a system where we can avoid the vast problems of expropriation without compensation, where the government wants to become the custodian of land. And I think we can all agree here that the ANC, the EFF, and even the DA would not have the interests of the people in heart if it was to pass. They would benefit their friends, their elites, and it would not benefit the genuine people if that was the case. Now, I do believe in land restitution. I do believe that the people and the families and the descendants of people who have lost their land should get their land back. And I think the system that needs to happen is actually what was happening in the early 20th century under Mbeki, where they started it, but due to ANC incompetence and corruption, it basically fell apart. Do that, change the system with some more competent people in charge to basically track down who actually owns the land, because we actually do have the records. The party government did keep the records. So that's something where we can actually just start a concerted effort to see who actually has the ownership going back. There's a philosopher named Nozick who believes that you cannot have a moral transfer of property unless you ensure that going back, that you can actually, you can go back and ensure that every transfer was legal. So basically go back and do that rather than this broad approach of broad nationalization, which is the EFF and ANC wants to do. I prefer it on a family and individual basis.
Okay, Hugo, and then back to Fadiel.
Yeah, look, on the issue of land, I don't own any property, so I'm already a serf. It's very mute point to me, really. I don't actually see the value in owning lots of land. I think it's sometimes more of a burden than anything. Of course, the state-owned property historically didn't work, but just on expropriation, it has worked in the various countries throughout the world. So I don't actually get what the stress is about. It worked in South Korea, and that brought about the South Korean middle class when they expropriated the kings. It worked in India, in the north of India, and Rajasthan, and it worked in the former East Germany. And there's other solutions around the world. We can pick one of them. We can analyze it and say, okay, let's try one of them. Give people back the land that they own. But what goes missing in this conversation to me is just the population of South Africa. People are not very good with numbers. South Africa in 1900, I think there was about 1 million white guys running around and 3 million black people, something of this sort. Today, we're much bigger. So the entire population of South Africa in 1900 was less than the size of Johannesburg or even Cape Town, I think, today. So, there was much more land available back then. I'm sure most of them were grabbed, some of them were taken, some of them were empty. There's a lot. We can go through history and see what happened there. Now the question is, what do you do with so many million people? Where are you going to find all the land for all of them, even if you want to expropriate it? So there's lots of land available. And my solution to this is, and this is actually something I've written about, is we need to challenge this theology of smart cities and restricting urban sprawl. Because there's this theology, I say, especially about the DA, they're the strongest with this thing, that we need to stop cities from expanding to the outskirts. Okay, now if you look at the history of how cities developed, they actually all sprawled. Okay, and I can tell you that Shanghai today is less dense than it was on the communist eras. So just let people build on the land there is, give them land for free. I mean, I'm willing to say, take all the land that the state owns in South Africa, give it all to the black and colored and Indian people, doesn't matter. Okay. They will either keep it or sell it or build something on it because they're rational people, they're rational human beings, and the market will correct for itself. I honestly don't understand what all the emotion is about, particularly regarding to the white people, why they're so scared of this thing. Sure, if you've got assets in a property, but if you own one property, it's not a lot of money. Many people have got stocks in the stock market that's worth way more than this. So to me, it's like, we're creating commotion where there is none. It's sort of like when the HIV pandemic was there and we all saw that AIDS is going to kill everyone. If you actually look in the data, South Africa's population increased during the HIV pandemic, right? There was no pandemic per definition. It's like COVID. We stretched about a little bit of a small number. So yeah, it's just emotional rhetoric to me. It's politicians climbing on the bandwagon because I want to get votes to promise you land and jobs and whatever. So I don't see the argument really.
Fadiel?
Yo, can I buy that man a bells? I'd like to add to that when it comes to land expropriation, that there must be a sunset clause to it. Otherwise, every time the government runs into trouble, they will drag the most emotional topic in the country back to the fore. So I would say, look, let's settle the land issue within 5 years. You got 5 years to do it. Let's appoint the most competent people out there. And let's get this done. Give people the land. Give it all. The state shouldn't own land. And like the man said, they will either develop it, sell it, squat on it, live on it. I really don't care. But what I'm saying is let us depopulate the ghettos where people like me live because of decisions taken 50 years ago. It's that simple.
Wynand, can we trust the government to respectfully redistribute the land?
Maybe I could start by saying that we should not put the EFF and the ANC in the same basket regarding land policy, because the idea of state custodianship over all land is maybe popular within the ANC, but it's not ANC policy, while that is in fact the EFF's policy. And the ANC is walking a tightrope between wanting to please the populist urge to expropriate land wholesale and give it back to whom it should belong, and still not doing it because they don't want to scare off international investors and so on. So they want to do something which else than they are saying, and that is why the ANC and the EFF could not reach each other, and that is why this Section 25 will not be changed shortly, because the ANC needs the numbers of the EFF in Parliament to get a two-thirds majority, and the EFF is not likely to do so. But I would like to say that land ownership is a reflection of the power relations within a country. And maybe it's sometimes a little bit, late. A few years after the power relations shifted, then land ownership only shifts. But land ownership will always reflect the power relation. And that is why, people can say whatever they like about wanting expropriation with compensation or without compensation or whatever. If you look at the 1913 land distribution and what happened after that, it reflected the power relation, not the number relations, but the power relation within the country. In the meantime, the power relation got in pace with the numbers relation. And one should actually realize, especially if you are white and you have land, that the current numbers in land distribution is not going to be, it's not going to be stagnant. And it's not a question about whether you want it or don't want it. It's a political reality that the power relation will be reflected in the ownership of land. Then, of course, there's also the problem of, are we speaking about farmland? Are we speaking about urban land? Farmland is even for an upper middle class person of any color, not affordable. Land is just too expensive. The old idea of a senior civil servant buying a little farm as a hobby. It's not possible anymore because the prices of land is just so inflated, actually above the production value of that land. So I think, one has to look the power relations within South Africa in the eye and say land ownership is going to move towards that. And then the question is always, what is the government's ability to do anything? I mean, if you ask the government, they will say, yes, there were some problems, but until now we are going to do it the right way. Now, one may have lots of sympathy with Mr. Ramaphosa. I'm sure he has good intentions, but nobody is ever all-powerful, even when he's the president, because he has to take cognizance of people within his own organization. He has to take cognizance of structural realities. And somebody told me, in Afrikaans, we don't have the distinction between weak and bad. It says President Ramaphosa is a weak president. Doesn't mean he's a bad president, but he's weak. He doesn't have the power to do what he wants to do. He might be a good person. It's a little bit like Louis XVI of France. A good person, a weak king. So I think we should be much more open-minded about where we are going and try to make a distinction between the emotional value of land, the whole idea of I belong, I am rooted, I am part of this country, and the economic part of it, and then also the juridical part. Fadiel mentioned that how could you create title deeds out of nothing? That's one of the main problems, that people come with a Western idea where land is divided into small blocks and each is assigned to somebody, and you positive you get it positified, if there's such a word, within the framework of a deeds office and a title deed for everyone, and then that becomes an objective reality, and then we go to court about this objective reality. But if you are a person who had lived in South Africa for centuries by the year 1650, then it's a completely artificial reality being imposed on another way of thinking about land and ownership. So we have to, we have to have our eyes open. In politics, I say there are two things you have to be able to do. You have to see your own point, and you have to be able to see the other guy's point. Some people just see the other guy's point and they can't stop making excuse for themselves. Some people can only see their own point and they don't have, they are tone deaf for other people's problems. And that is the crux of it all, is to being able to see it from both ways.
Nicholas?
So I think there's a lot of danger in going back too far when it comes to land claims. Now, the thing about looking at apartheid, forced removals, and 1920s Land Act, and I would say the 20th century, is a lot easier because there's records. We can track the families more easily and stuff like that. Now, the problem when we go too far back is that it becomes far more emotional and it starts muddying the waters. Now, there's not a single piece of land on this planet that has been inhabited by humans that has not faced migrations, conquest, conquering, annexation, and all that. Britain, the country which is regarded as the colonizer of the world, before it became the colonizer of the world, had been utterly pillaged and destroyed by multiple other nations, just by the Vikings for a few centuries alone, and all that time. And if you let's look at my ancestry. If I was to use my ancestry to start claiming land, I'm going to have to be very angry at the British, or the English, for taking my clan land away from me from my Scottish side. But then I can also be happy that I took some Scottish land because I've got some English in me as well. Humans are so intermarried and so muddied, especially in South Africa, with how many people have been living on top of each other for centuries, that I think that there has to be a sunset clause, as Fadiel said. You have to look back at a certain point. And I think the easiest way is to look back 20th century, and if you're going to go before that, you're just going to destroy it. Because then also, let's look at what the Zulus were doing at the same time, displacing countless people with Mifkane and all that. I think it's kind of it's dangerous to go back that far. The other thing about land and emotion, and actually, but also actually, no, let me actually return to a previous topic about the state is the main holder of land in this country. We don't actually have to even talk about expropriation without compensation, because that implies the state's going to expropriate private property. But the majority landowner in the country is the state. They don't need to expropriate it from anyone. They should just start distributing it if that's what they actually care about. They don't, because that's not really what they care about. They care about lining their own pockets, and they care about their own control, and they care about the ability to get votes by promising to fulfill a vendetta. And also, if they truly cared, they would have abolished the tribal trust lands, which are not a traditional African custom. It's an artifact of apartheid that still hasn't been ended, because one of the main primary strategies of colonialism is that you appoint local leaders, local elites, to basically rule over a piece of land, and then you just enforce them. And that was the British did that first. Then apartheid latched onto it, enforced it, and now we still have it. Abolish the Bantustans, because that's what they are. People who have been living on that land currently, give them their title deeds, kind of like the Free Market Foundation's Kaya Alarm project. And we've already sorted out most of our issues. And then we can just sort out all our laws, which are stopping economic growth. And then we can start actually developing proper urban centers so people can actually go back to the provinces where they want to live, rather than coming to the cities where they have to live to make a living. Just imagine if the Eastern Cape actually became viable to live in. It would sort out a hang of a lot of problems. I think that there is policy issues in this country, and that's policy and institutions are the things that need to be fixed across Africa, but especially in South Africa.
This has become a land debate. Fadiel, I keep referring back to Fadiel because he's very concise to our viewers. This is not favoritism. Fadiel is very concise with his words. Fadiel, you're muted.
Sorry, man. The only part where I would disagree with the previous speaker is how far we go back. I say let's go back as far as we can. I would say let us lance this boil, this abscess. Let's get all the pus out and let us start to heal. You see, if we're going to use the 20th century as a yardstick, then we might as well tell 2-3 million people, guys, sorry, this is what it is. I'm not in favor of that. Everything else I disagree with him. I mean, I agree with him 100%. But I would say let us take this thing back as far as we can. Remember that in South Africa, in 1652, when Jan van Riebeeck got off that boat, he found my ancestors here. There's no argument. Even his own history says that. When he arrived in KZN via boat, he went all the way along the coastline. He found my ancestors here. You know, we weren't migratory people. We were seasonal people. We would move where the food and the water was. It's just that simple. Just because someone came here and found the land empty doesn't mean it wasn't owned. So I'm not quite in favor of let's restrict this to the 20th century. I would say that in order for justice to take place, and justice is what we need in this country, let us go back as far as humanly possible and let us start there. Whatever the starting point is, whatever the pain is. This is South Africa, man. You know, if there's one thing that we're good at is recovery. Unfortunately, I still think we only have 7 years to do it. Thanks.
Hugo? I get quickly, Wynand.
Yes. Wynand or me?
Guys, sorry. I'm just going to put my video off intermittently as I see my sound drags on my side, man, because it seems to get better when I switch off.
Okay.
So just don't mind me.
No problem. Wynand, quickly.
Okay. Now, I just want to say, in this whole question of land, you never go back. You always go forward. You just use the past as an argument. That's all. It's an argument for this or for that group, and every group uses it to its own advantage and interpret it in another way. So would we perhaps want to call all the Matabeles out of Zimbabwe back because before 1837 they in fact ruled over the whole highveld of the Old Transvaal and the Free State? Or would we say, let's take all the black people back to the Great Lakes area where they had been thousands of years back? Of course not. It's silly. I mean, I know a huge portion of the Zimbabwean population is with us already, but it's not because they were called back for land restitution or because they ruled over this or that for a very long time. So, you know, I would like to take this whole moral thing a little bit out of it. Some people have the moral advantage that they had been disadvantaged in the previous dispensation, but it's only just a lever of power to use to get a bigger portion of the present day wealth of the country. And Afrikaners did the same. The Boer republics was from there to there, and that's all our land. Everyone does it. You don't maybe malignantly misinterpret history. You just see it from your perspective. And that's why I say we are always going to move forward according to the power relations of the day. And, well, that's it.
Okay, Hugo, it seems like going that far back is impractical.
I think this whole argument is really ridiculous from beginning to end. First of all, I didn't know Wynand was a postmodernist where he said everyone must predict history according to his own interpretation. No, I think just what he said first before he just spoke, I completely disagree with. The idea that black people didn't have a sense of ownership before the Europeans came to Africa is completely false. It's just blatantly false. They owned cattle, they had a sense of ownership, they had markets between them. There's been lots of history being done on that. It's just wrong. So they know
But
that
in terms of the land, weren't they thieves?
No, I mean, the thing is this, South Africa back then had such a tiny population. So when you say when the Europeans got there, it was in a sense empty, but it wasn't completely empty, okay? So again, if you take the population in 1600, whatever the size it will be, everyone would probably earn a square kilometer or two if you divide it equally among South Africans. And I keep getting to this. We tend to forget how big the population is today. We don't understand intuitively exponential growth. But, you know, all these things aside, whether we go down to 60-50 or whether I can go claim back the Roman Empire when Julius Caesar kicked out my Germanic ancestor, I don't know. What I do know, though, is this. When the Shah of Iran, for example, passed the White Revolution, he kicked off the landlords and he gave ownership to the population. It happened in Peru as well, which was the only country to defeat a Marxist homegrown revolution by giving title deeds to everyone under Ananda Versoto. It happened in South Korea. It happened in Northern India. I see no problem in saying let's have a national policy to increase home ownership. Everyone gets to own a home. Everyone gets to own a piece of land, whatever you want. And a shack is not a piece of land and a home. I mean, I think it's very indignifying to people. And I think Fadiel will agree with me on that. So if we have a national policy to say, listen, we want to make every South African a home owner. And sure, there are some people like District 6 in the Cape who were deprived of their houses. They should probably get back what they, you know, what they if their grandparents were kicked out of it. And, you know, whether the state pays and how much we pay, we can dispute those things. It's actually not a lot of money. So I find this debate idiotic in a certain sense, that we are thinking that if you're going to own land, you're going to be rich and prosperous. I see very little evidence for that, frankly. If you take the Jewish population, throughout history, they've migrated. They earned very few assets, you know, physically, but they invested into their children, into themselves. And it's ultimately the intellectual capital that made them prosper worldwide. So you can take, yeah, you can take all the white people's land. Let's take the farmers. How many farmers do we have? 20, 30,000 for argument's sake, okay? You can only physically replace them 20, 30,000 black farmers, because our land are that big for the agricultural yield to exist, for example. So you run into all these practical problems. My advice is, let's have a national policy that says everyone gets to own a home. Okay, it's actually in our constitution, as far as I know. Everyone should. South Africa's constitution guarantees a right to home. Okay, and I don't mean an RDP house in a shack. And let's say, okay, we're going to have a sensible policy to zone certain areas of the city for new development, because not everyone can go back where their ancestors were. Then you're going to have shacks again in District 6, because it's just the size area doesn't work out. We can give back. We can go back to 1650. We can go back to the Roman Empire. You know, if there's any value in that, sure. I don't see it, but I think there's just too much emotion around the issue. Nobody's being practical about it. And honestly, I don't see the value in investing in property. I find it to be a very bad investment per se. People who own a second and a third house and have to rent it out, you always
what would your investment advice be if I now had R1 million?
Well, I would invest in not in South Africa at this moment, because our economy is so bad. Put it in the growing economies. Put it in Singapore. You know, if you don't invest in acronyms. That's my way. Don't invest in bricks. Okay. If you invest in the acronym called JUNK, you have Japan, the United States, Korea, and the Netherlands. Okay, well, combined. So invest in something that makes economic sense. Most of the assets on the stock exchange belong to pension funds, for example. So, you know, we've got this 21st century economy, and then people still think, well, I need to own a property and a house to be rich. It just makes no sense. If there's an emotional argument, deal with it, get it over and done with, and move forward. But I find a lot of resistance from, and I have to say as an Afrikaner, from the Afrikaner community saying, well, they're going to take our land and they're going to come for this. You know, honestly, most Afrikaners don't farm today. The word boere is outdated, right? You know, so I just look at this thing and I say, you know, I've now been out of South Africa for 6 years and you're still debating things that we talked about 10, 20 years ago. Get it over and done with and move on, you know, because it's really annoying, frankly.
Fadiel?
I like this man. I like this man. I find nothing to disagree with. I think we should take the emotion out of it. I think we should be pragmatic about it. You see, for some people, it becomes an argument about who gets what, gets where. For me, it becomes a spatial argument. You see, if you go to my workplace, I'm protected by the labor law that says X amount of people may work in X amount of square meters for safety. But then you come to the ghetto and there's no such rule. I have households with 30, 40 people living in 2 bedrooms. We are saying, release the land, give us our freedom, allow our children to live. You see, we've got 3,500 dead bodies on the Cape Flats every year on year. That's gunshots only. Why? Because of overcrowding. We are saying, bugger everything else. Free the land. give our children an opportunity to grow old. That's it.
Yeah, the problem I just see is, can you trust the ANC with any more power than it currently has?
No.
But Nicholas?
No.
Donald, I think that actually what I've realized here, and I mentioned it earlier, but I'm just going to reiterate again. I think this actually has nothing to do with expropriation without compensation. I don't know why it keeps coming up, because Hugo has actually explained it already. The majority owner of land in this country is the government. They don't need to expropriate a single bit of private property. They can release the land and it can start being distributed. You don't have to argue with anyone. You don't have to compensate anyone, because unless the government really wants to pay itself, which it probably will, because that's very good for corruption. I don't think this has anything to do with supporting or even opposing expropriation without compensation, because this has to do with the land the government owns and is leaving unproductive, and has to do with the ex-Bantustans, which are still Bantustans, which are still in the hands of corrupt customary leaders. And at the same time, it also has to do with the bad policies that restrict people from being able to have fruitful employment, which will be able to grow our economy, grow wealth, and be able to make easier access to credit, to be able to invest, to be able to develop. And everything can just basically be fixed in this country by liberalizing and allowing people to actually get jobs. I agree with Hugo that owning land, it's actually a liability. The only reason I would ever want to own land is if I want a place which I'm allowed to blow up stuff for fun, and I don't have to worry about anyone shouting at me. I think that Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world, says that real estate is one of the stupidest investments you can ever have. He's rented most of his homes until his wife basically pressured him to do it, and he's still bitter about buying one house.
Can I explain why that's true, by the way? If you buy a house, okay, if you rent out, I think, and you don't pay it off in 15 years, you lose statistically, because if the geyser breaks, you need to get a plumber out, and then you don't make out your return on investment. So, renting a house for 15 years, if you cannot pay it off in a loan, is actually better than buying it with a 20, 30-year loan, just financially speaking. So a lot of people fall for the con game from the bank. They get and then also, if you own a property and you get a job in another city, it's very difficult to sell sometimes. People tell you property is an investment. Well, wait until you have to move away. And who's going to buy it? Then you realize the bank oversold you on the loan, and you always have a little bit of a difference. So I just look at this thing and I say, from just an investment point of view, I don't understand the debate in South Africa. Honestly, I would say, take all the white farmers for land, give it away, for goodness sake. I know they're not going to like me for saying it. We will not suffer from food shortages. It's just a wrong argument, because there's lots of countries that don't produce their own food and can import. Okay, I'm not saying let's do that, but I'm saying, for argument's sake, if you do that even. So the amount of land that is being owned and that we are fighting about is such a small percentage of the total land in South Africa. It is. It's something that is just weird to me. It's like people cannot move on from history. Some people top over religion. I think they're topping over land. And as I say, move on. There's far greater problems in South Africa. Violence is, as Fadiel says, one problem, probably the most important one to solve at the moment. Unemployment, economic policy. We can sort all those things out. How are we going to manage, when most people in South Africa cannot use a computer? You're struggling with those things in an economy that's increasingly diversified. We've got a knowledge-based economy. So unless we get to that debate, we're going to be stuck in the 18th century. And you know what? The rest of the world doesn't care for us. Mexico is moving ahead. Okay, India is moving ahead. Mauritius, many South Africans are buying offshore homes in Mauritius because the property investment in South Africa is bad. So,
liability, because land's
move on and get it over with.
Okay, Wynand?
Well, there are several things I would like to respond to. The first one is that Hugo got me completely wrong if you think I said that black people didn't have a sense of ownership. Of property. Say that, or said it, missaid what I meant. There have been all kinds of things, but there's into parcels, each represented by a title deed. That is a little bit un-African. Regarding land, what I think both Nicholas and Hugo clearly illustrated is that when you buy land, the land doesn't belong to you, you belong to the land. And that is in fact what is so very attractive about it for many people. Many people want to belong to the land. it gives some kind of a cultural and emotional rootedness, and therefore you might have an elite who feel disconnected with land and only want to make investments which makes financial sense, which land does not in the same sense than other stuff. I've seen all those graphs. If you invested what you pay for your house into this share or in that index or whatever, you would have been off much better. And somehow, although those arguments have been convincingly conveyed for the past 30 years, well, that's a time I've heard it, maybe it has been conveyed very much longer, people still don't buy it. People still want their homes, they still feel connected. And I think back to the beginning, if we talk about the state of South Africa, the state of South Africa, not the state, the land, but also the situation in South Africa, is that South Africa is an heritage of the British Empire. It's a small part of the British Empire and a small empire in itself. And every group who inherited this empire did not want to disband it or dismantle it. They did not want to lose it. So it was an empire created by the British Empire in 1910.
Wow.
It's a lot of lag, Wynand.
So I'm not the only one.
No, it's Wynand. It's Wynand.
Just worried for a second.
Okay, Fadiel, you can fall in if you want.
Joining South Afrikaners got hold of this, not want to the empire. You have the access. Okay, all I want to say is, and that is what we are, it's one of the main problems.
What's going on?
I don't know if I lost you.
Yeah. No, you're back, Wynand. Sorry, you disconnected there.
Okay. Well, yeah, I don't know. Let me just say it shortly that this South African empire has been a British empire, it has been an Afrikaner empire, now it's an ANC empire. And as a construct, it doesn't make very much sense, but an empire tends to have one owner, one master, one group who is the master of that. And currently it's the ANC, and they're not going to let go of it easily. It will be a little bit of a problem. We have an artificial construct created about 100 years ago, and I don't think it has a lot more time to go before it will fall apart.
Can I just say that there's
Quickly.
an industry in South Africa, like there's a racism industry, like there is a industry for all the atrocities in the world, a Holocaust industry, a Armenian genocide industry, a Anglo-Boer War industry, a apartheid industry. So it's an industry based on emotion. There's a lot of people making a hell of a lot of money out of the grievances of people that are long dead and fights that were fought 100, 200, 300 years ago. Okay. And I find land reform is just another one of these con games. The people who are saying they want to solve land reform, they don't want to solve it because then they lose their money. Okay, and just look at the amount of books and they can sell, and just look at who's that clown in Cape Town, McKaiser, who goes on about racism, this and that and whatever. So I see this as exactly the same con game. It's a psychological issue. Okay, people feel attached to land. Well, you know what? I'm not here to solve your psychological problems. I want a practical solution, right? If you feel emotional and tired because your great uncle lived in that land, fine, get over it. But honestly, it is to me one of the most irritating issues in South Africa, because I just find that I say it's for the last 30 years, people have been talking about it. I believe some land has been transferred about it yet. And every time there's a new election, it's like name changes. You know, we're going to propose to change the name of a new city. We never really change it, but we always threaten to do so. So we can vote, we can get that extra 2 to 3% to swing the election. This is sort of where land reform is, in my view. So, yeah, again, I don't see it being solved. I don't think it's going to be solved. I think I'm quite an individualist. I believe you're on your own. I don't really see much evidence for the fact that we have an elite that is, you know, whose power relations depends on who owns the land. I don't see much of that. And also I see it's kind of irrelevant what happens in government in South Africa, because I think South Africa is fundamentally changing right in front of our eyes. And one reason for that is I think it's because the media has changed. I believe in Marshall McLuhan's thesis of the medium is the message. Whenever communication changes, society fundamentally changes. And I would, if I can play Nostradamus, but make a prediction 10, 20 years down the line, the ANC is still going to bitch and moan about land. We won't get anywhere with that thing. And most people will just move on and fix their own lives. You know, and that's kind of, let's say.
Guys, my daughter ran out, so I had to go out and buy some more. Sorry, man. So I missed quite a chunk of that. I'm sorry. I would like to put this to bed by saying that I understand the economic argument. Property is a terrible investment. I get it. What I need you to understand is that from where I stand, property is security. Property is shelter. It's a place to lay my head. Hundreds of thousands of people in my community do not have that. It's why land is emotional to us. It's why the land issue is important to us. I get everything that everyone said. But understand that when you're living in a shack in someone else's yard, or even worse, when you're living in a shack in an open field, no running water, no electricity, no safety, no security, all we're saying is, as the previous speaker spoke, and I don't want to echo the man all the time because then I have absolutely no use here, is let us get it done. Let us have this national conference. Let us agree that every South African should own a piece of land with a house. What happens after that, not my concern. That's it.
Okay, and Nicholas, I think you can start with a concluding statement. So if you want to finish on that point, and then we can move on to the others.
If I may, actually, I would like to just respond to
sure,
Wynand,
but just conclude with what you want to end on, if you want to end on something.
I just wanted to say that South Africa is an empire. I agree with that. But it's very weird that it's an empire that's trying to be a nation. Now, there's actually two distinct political entities in history: nation states and empires. Empires are the most ancient, which was, we know what they are, large, vast portions of territory where there's a metropole that controls a diverse amount of people who are contained within this large territory. Nation states are actually comparatively quite new, where generally a singular culture, language, effectively a group of people who have some common heritage decided that they wanted to govern themselves. The problem with South Africa is constantly trying to be a nation state with a centralized government, with language policies, with all these other, trying to dictate upon many diverse people, but they're doing it as if there are one ethnic group trying to do it to other ethnic groups. The thing about empires, good or bad, is that they will function in a way that took into account the diverse nature of the people living under them. The British, for all their faults, knew that you couldn't just have you couldn't ram a square peg into a round hole. You had to adjust policies for particular peoples. And that's the problem with South Africa, is that if it wanted to be an effective empire, it needed to decentralize heavily. It would need to be a confederacy or a federation. It would need to allow for local autonomy in order to keep it all together. So that's why I think that the South African empire either needs to actually start acting like a proper empire and taking good advice from the past, not the bad one, there's plenty of bad advice, or split up into genuine nation states that reflect its people. That's it.
Wynand, last words, concluding statement?
No, I think Nicholas put it quite succinctly. The problem is with this empire acting like a nation state, and I would just again point Hugo's attention to it, that I didn't say land ownership defines the power relation. It's the other way causes the way in which now my internet is stable again. Okay, I'll leave it to that. In this kind of empire, the dominant always end up with most of the land. And if you don't like it, powerful parts of the empire, you're under the empire. Thank you. That was all I had to say. I don't know if you still get me.
Thank you, Wynand. Okay, Hugo, you have the last words.
Yeah, so just get the story done. All this talk of history, empires, who owns what, I just find it so relevant. I see it's an investment problem. I'm an engineer, maybe I'm too pragmatic. I stay in France for what it's worth. So, I don't have property in South Africa. I'm speaking as a non-conflicted party, I guess. But I honestly find the debate to be borderline childish at this stage. It should have been done ages ago. I don't think it will be done for emotional reasons, because, as I say, there's a lot of people who make a lot of money out of land not being done, land reform not being done in South Africa. And that includes the ANC, and that includes some of the Afrikaner intellectuals as well, who constantly reinterpret history, and I don't know what the hell they're doing with their lives, but that's their game they're playing. So yeah, just get it over and done with.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Very interesting conversation, very interesting land debate conversation. To our viewers, if you've made it this far, please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and this has been WorldView.